Hello and welcome back, my video game enjoyers. It's me, Luxon from Luxon, finally succeeding to climb out of the Dawn Trail Trench, just so I can bring you another unnecessary discussion on a completely subjective topic nobody actually cares about. Don't you love content? Like, comment, and subscribe, by the way! Alright, the Xeno community as a whole does not really seem to have a consensus as to the nature of the list of characters who count as Xeno protagonists. This, obviously, is completely fine, because it really doesn't matter for anything significant in the long run, and the list is only going to get larger with every new game that's released, so it doesn't really matter if we have no consensus on it now, because in a year or so there's going to be a new game that we're also going to have to let stew for a few years before we know exactly who counts for that one. That being said, I want to talk about my personal criteria for this. So for the rest of the video, I'm just kind of going to explain my thought process for my own personal list, which is my own personal list formed from my own personal opinions and should not have any effect on your list if your own personal opinions are different to mine. And I don't really need to talk about spoilers. I am going to need to give one major spoiler for Xenoblade 1, but other than that, I think we're basically spoiler free. So if you don't mind some spoilers, but not the ending for the best entry point game in the series, you could watch this without having played a Xeno thing at all. Now, I would probably judge you for watching a video that talks about every Xeno game if you've never played a Xeno game, but I watch analysis and explanation videos for series I literally don't care about all the time, so if you don't know what a Xeno is and just got this on autoplay or randomly in your recommendations, hello, thanks for the support. I can't complain at all if you're watching this, even if you don't ever play the series or watch another one of my videos again. Yeah. Instead of alphabetizing or going by a game, I'm going to split this into different categories that are more or less in order of least contentious to most contentious. While yes, there not being a community consensus doesn't really matter, I think it makes more sense to kind of ease into the video by starting with people more people are going to agree on, and get into the more nitty-gritty justifying my weirder picks later on. So first off, we have the characters that I think literally no one watching this video is going to argue with me on when I say that they're a protagonist of a Xeno work. Those are Fei Fong Wong from Xenogears, Shion Uzuki from Xenosaga, Shulk from Xenoblade 1, Rex from Xenoblade 2, and Noah from Xenoblade 3. These are all extremely self-explanatory, I would think. Even if they're not a super big player in the world of their individual games, they are one of, if not the most important character to the story. They're also usually the POV character for most, if not the entirety, of their games. They're also, all with the exception of Shulk and Shion in only Xenosaga 2, in your starting party when you begin each game, as well as the character who is the most all-rounder and able to be used and built in many different scenarios to do different things, because it would make sense for you to have, I don't know, the protagonist in your party. While everyone agrees with me on this, I think you can also agree with me when I say that this list is definitely not comprehensive. Not only are we missing several games, but I think we could also reasonably say that some characters from the games I've already talked about are additional co-protagonists to the ones I've already outlined. Also, they're all guys except for Shion, and that just doesn't seem right for a series like Xeno. Firstly, let's add in a couple games that have not been mentioned yet, starting with Xenoblade X, the one main game that I have not talked about at all yet. And yeah, there is a non-zero amount of contention here, which is the only reason it wasn't in the no contention section, but there are really only two potential choices for this, and we have a lot of precedent showing that the developers of Xenoblade themselves are always going to choose Elma over the created character. Yes, your own personal created character is the main character of the story. They're the most customizable character. They're the one you are controlling at all times and never leaves your party at all. Something that can't be said about a lot of the protagonists I already talked about. You are also an MMO main character, and Elma is the actual protagonist that you're tagging along with. The story revolves around her past and her actions and her connections with other people, and while she doesn't particularly develop over it, it's the base story of an MMO without any expansions. It makes sense for not many characters to have completed arcs, including the main character. And then there's also just the fact that Elma has her backstory explored a bit, you never learn anything about the main character. You experience the world through the eyes of another character, but it is not your story at all. And this is backed up not necessarily by anything in the game itself saying, okay, Elma is the protagonist, or even any promotional material around it, but how X has been treated after that. It was Elma, not a generic appearance of Cross, who got into Xenoblade 2 as a guest. It was Elma, not a generic appearance of Cross, who showed up in the Xenoblade series' 10th anniversary art representing Xenoblade X, alongside Shulk and Rex, again cementing that, hey, maybe those two are the protagonists of their games. And Elma has a spirit in Smash Ultimate. Lyn has a spirit in Smash Ultimate. Lao has a spirit in Smash Ultimate. Those three are probably the three most important characters to all of X. Elma is just obviously the most important of the three. Cross does not have a spirit in Smash Ultimate. Do you know who does have a spirit in Smash Ultimate? Tatsu and a generic Formula Skell. If they wanted Cross to be considered an important character outside the game of X itself, there probably would have been some kind of protagonist parentheses Xenoblade X spirit in Smash. Elma is, for all intents and purposes, the protagonist of X, and will most likely outlive Xenoblade X because we don't even know if that's ever getting followed up on. Next, we have the additional stories for all three numbered Xenoblade games. Future Connected for 1, Tona the Golden Country for 2, and Future Redeemed for 3. We are going to hold off on Tona for a little bit because that one a lot of people argue about, and just talk about Connected and Redeemed. Connected is extremely simple. While Shulk is there, Melia is 100% the protagonist of this game. You start out in control of her, despite Shulk being the protagonist from the main game and playing the exact same as he did there. She is the central figure of the story. Shulk is there, he is just a supporting character helping his friend out, and this was created purely because staff at Monolith Soft felt bad about how they ended Melia's character arc in the original Xenoblade 1, so they jumped on the chance to do something about her when they made a definitive edition and had enough budget to do an expansion like this. Future Redeemed is just as simple as Connected was. We don't add any new protagonists to the list because the protagonist of this is Faye again. Hold on, it appears I'm getting updated information. The guy in Future Redeemed is named Matetahu, and is a completely different character from Faye, so it looks like he's a new one. In all seriousness, Shulk and Rex are there, but they are as supporting and mentor characters. A is there, but you can't really call A protagonist. It's very clearly Matthew's story, and Nicole and Glimmer are again just other party members the same way every game in the series has other party members. This is Matthew's story. He doesn't necessarily go through a character arc because it's a shorter thing than a full game, but it's ultimately his character that shapes the events and how they affect Xenoblade 3 later on. And no, we're not calling Dmitry Yuriev a protagonist for Future Redeemed. We will be pushing Tona off for a little bit longer and instead talk about more Xenosaga stuff. Because you could very easily argue that Shion is not the only person to be a protagonist of a Xenosaga game. Episode 1 is primarily about her, and Episode 3 is also primarily about her while also ending as many character arcs as possible, but there are 3 additional Xenosaga entries where she isn't really the protagonist. The first is Xenosaga Episode 2. As I mentioned before, this is the one game where she is not in your starting party. Episode 2 starts off with a flashback detailing past events, and this is actually the only reason Shulk isn't in the starting party of Xenoblade 1, but it's a bit different. When you get out of the flashback, your starting party also does not include Shion, and instead, Junior, a supporting cast member from the first game, is the party lead here. And while Shion gets moments and gets to do cool things and she progresses her arc, ultimately, this is Junior's story. The entire game is not told from his point of view. The party is split enough times where there are some Shion segments apart from him, but it primarily revolves around his flashbacks, his supporting cast, his character arc, and ultimately the emotional confrontation that forms the late game is around him and stuff related to him in his past. There are also 2 major entries in the Xenosaga series that are 100% canon outside of the 3 numbered games. first off is Xenosaga Pied Piper, which is another prequel that is ludicrously inaccessible and never even got a full fan translation because it was a mobile phone game from the early 2000s, exclusive to Japan, and contains a lot of canon information. Anyway, this revolves around the backstory of Ziggy, a supporting party member in all three main Xenosaga games, but he is purely the main character of Pied Piper. He's one of the first party members you get. The entire story is told through his POV. He is the central character. The entire point of this is to tell his backstory and his relationship to a few other characters. Pied Piper is teased in the ending of episode 2 that shows him recognize a character whose face we see for the first time, and then it begins with him already knowing that character, so we explore that relationship. This is the Ziggy game, and it should be considered as important a canon prequel as Tona and Future Redeemed are to Xenoblade 2 and 3, so it is the exact same situation, prequel with a new protag. Then we have the interquel between episode 2 and 3. The only audio-visual entry in the main canon with even less gameplay than Xenogears Disc 2, the Flash series Xenosaga A Missing Year, which tells the story of an important thing that happens during the 1-year time skip between 2 and 3. The thing about A Missing Year is that Shion isn't really the main character, even though she is a major character in it. While the majority of the plot is about a character that Shion specifically has a lot of connection and backstory to, and that relationship is the emotional core of the entire thing, Shion is a much less active character in Missing Year compared to even episode 2, where she already takes the backseat. Instead, the characters mainly doing the action stuff are her brother Jin and series poster girl Cosmos. Jin is the one who does the exploring, a lot of the character interactions. He is the one investigating and finds out a lot of the plot twists on his own. And Shion actually doesn't fight at all, despite being a competent fighter and party member in every other main Xenosaga game. She just has Cosmos do the fighting for her, and while a few things happen to further Cosmos' stuff, she is also mostly there as a bodyguard, and Shion is just kinda around in a few different locations while characters talk to her and plot events happen around her. Jin is ultimately the driving force in all of this, uncovering everything that happens, and really it boils down to the fact that I can't consider a character who is not a playable party member to be the protagonist of a JRPG. And if Missing Year was a JRPG, there would likely be 3 party members in it. Shion is not one of them, and Jin would be the POV for the majority of the game, so I do kind of have to give this one to Jin. That being said, it's weird to just not consider Cosmos to be a protagonist of Xenosaga when she is the only character on the box art for 2 of the 3 main games, and she's Cosmos. She's more frequently showing up in crossover stuff than Shion is for the Xenosaga series, so what about that? It just feels wrong to not call Cosmos a protagonist for Xenosaga. And, well, she definitely has a space. And that is because you need to think about what Xenosaga was originally conceptualized as. Like Xenogears before it, prior to sales things happening and budget things happening and ambitions getting out of control, Xenosaga was intended as a 6-episode sci-fi space opera anthology that went across various worlds and time periods, with the constant of Cosmos being in all of them. The final Xenosaga trilogy we got was repurposed from plans from the original concepts for episodes 1 and 2 of that anthology, which were going to be direct sequels to each other and have to do with a character similar to Shion and her deal. In fact, Shion's main character moment in actual Xenosaga 2 is roughly where the planned episode 1 was going to end, so even some of her arc got cut off, with an ending not originally part of all that stuff, but tied together every loose end that would have been explored in the other parts of the anthology added onto the back of that, with still enough open-ended left over for Cosmos to show up again. I feel like if Cosmos was originally intended to be the overarching protagonist of the 6-game Xenosaga anthology, And Xenosaga ends in a way where Cosmos could be in a future game if they ever made one. And she is present and an important force in Xenosaga Episode 2 and Missing Year, 2 of the 3 saga entries where you can't really call Shion the protagonist. It's really okay to call Cosmos the protagonist of the entire series, while Shion is the protagonist of 1 and 3, Junior has 2, Jin has Missing Year, and Ziggy has Pied Piper, which is the least involvement she has, largely because it takes place before she ever existed. There are also 3 Xenosaga Episode 1 drama CDs that expand more on the characters and do appear to be canon. However, I have not listened to those yet, though they do have a fan translation, and they appear to just be extensions of Episode 1, detailing backstory to certain characters that appear primarily there, and expanding on events that are already in the game, so you can't really call them a completely separate entry, so we can't really add anything more onto there because Shion, Cosmos, Junior, and Ziggy are all main characters in Episode 1 who get expanded on. Ultimately, Xenosaga is probably best viewed not as an anthology as originally intended, but as a series with an ensemble cast, and while Junior, Jin, and Ziggy get to headline individual bits of the series, Shion and Cosmos are ultimately the 2 most important characters, and I would say the primary protagonists of Xenosaga. If I had to choose 2 characters to show up, I would not do what Project Cross Zone did and bring Shion and Cosmos in instead of shoehorning Telos. While we're on the topic of having multiple protagonists for one entry in the series, let's talk about Tona, because people get weird about Tona. Is Torna's protagonist Laura? Is it Jin? Or is it Laura and Jin? You can't really justify it being anything other than some combination of the 2 of them, just simply because no other character is as focused on and as significant, and, well, yeah, Laura and Jin are not the biggest players going on. We are experiencing the Aegis War of 500 years ago through their eyes. Ultimately, though, I think we have to at least give Laura the edge over Jin, even if she isn't necessarily the only protagonist. And that is because of character arc stuff. Laura has her entire arc in Tona, as this is a prequel, and Laura is a character who cannot live 500 years, so she's not present in the main game to develop any further. But Jin is a character in both Tona and the main game, and his development in the main game is furthering what happened in Tona. So his entire character arc is not in the prequel expansion. While Laura is not the point of view character for a small section of the game that Jin is present for, and they are pretty much together for the entire rest of it, experiencing the same story at the same time, it's really, really hard to justify not calling Laura the protagonist. At most, she's a protagonist, and a weird argument that people are really caught up on for some reason is the fact that Jin is the save data icon for Tona, and well, Rex is the protagonist of Xenoblade 2, and he's the save icon there, so that means Jin must be the protagonist. And Laura can't be, because she's not the save icon. Okay, only one character needs to write down stuff in a diary if they're both together keeping track of things. It is also more in character for Jin to be the one taking all this stuff down, and if they're both protagonists, it would make sense for the one that it makes sense to do the writing to do that. Also, the entire point of Xenoblade 2 is the bond between Driver and Blade, and Jin and Laura are literally the first Driver-Blade pair to work together the same way Drivers and Blades do in the base game 500 years later. So that's probably worth something as well. So, like, it should be Laura and Jin, and Laura should be first because she is the more prominent character of the 2 as far as the story goes, and her entire story is told in the expansion and some flashbacks from the base game, while Jin's keeps going on in Xenoblade 2. As for Xenoblade 2 as a whole, there's also the Aegis. You know, the kind of driving force of the entire plot of both games, and it's also a little weird to not consider any of them as a protagonist. The issue with that is, there are multiple Aegises, and while yeah, if you considered Pyra and Mithra the same character, then they would probably be a co-protagonist with Rex of Xenoblade 2 for very obvious reasons. They are very obviously different characters, and that's also kind of an important part of 2. So I feel wrong saying, yeah, Pyra and Mithra combined are the other protagonist. But I think, similar to Cosmos being an overarching protagonist of the entirety of Xenosaga, you could consider Mythra being an overarching protagonist for the entirety of Xenoblade 2. She is a major character in Tona the Golden Country, and while she's not present for the beginning of base game Xenoblade 2, she does show up later on. Her character arc, decisions, personality, and relationships influence a lot of other things, and she has a complete arc and conclusion over the entirety of expansion and base game. You could argue the same for Jin, but he is not a party member in base Xenoblade 2 and is an antagonist, so it's kind of hard to call him the protagonist when he better fits a role that literally means the opposite of the protagonist. And while you can have dual protagonists on completely different story paths, and you could probably have a sort of work where the two main characters are in opposition to each other that follows both of their point of views and focuses on both of them when they conflict, that's not what Xenoblade 2 does. You flash over to the villain side and you see Jin doing stuff, but the POV is Rex, and then later Rex and the Aegis. And, well, Mythra is the only Aegis to be a party member in both Tona and base game, so I think it's reasonable to call her an overarching protagonist for the entirety of Xenoblade 2. Honestly, though, that Mythra thing's probably the most contentious thing I've said so far, so we're gonna dial it back a little bit just by discussing other characters who could be co-protagonists for other Xeno games. The first is definitely the least contentious, because it's one you've been screaming at me the entire time, I'm sure, and that is, Mio is absolutely a second protagonist for Xenoblade 3 alongside Noah. There should be literally zero arguments with this, but for some reason people don't like the idea of a game having more than one protagonist unless it has like multiple actual routes. I'm considering doing a Trails version of this video eventually, and people are going to get very mad that I might consider some games to have multiple protagonists, outside of like just Reverie. Anyway, while Noah is the character you start with, the opening cutscene is through his POV. Ultimately, he is a little bit more important than Mio to the story. The entire point of Xenoblade 3 is also characters operating as units together. Noah and Mio combined are a much bigger deal than just Noah or just Mio separately. And, well, Mio and Noah's relationship is basically the entire emotional core of the game and part of major character arcs for both of them. It just doesn't really make sense to have one without the other. Also, like, while Noah gets a little bit more POV than Mio does, Mio gets the entire diegetic menuing thing that Jin had, as she's the one to write and narrate the journal at the end of every chapter, so that's probably got to count for something. And while I couldn't find any official material mentioning specifically if Jin or Laura is the main character of Tona, both Noah and Mio are called protagonists of Xenoblade 3 in official Nintendo of America publications, so that kind of settles it. Like, they say that for Shulk in Xenoblade 1, and no one thinks Shulk isn't the protagonist of Xenoblade 1. But wait, maybe people do think Xenoblade 1 has another protagonist. Alright, so like, you could kinda argue Fiora is a protagonist of Xenoblade 1, but it just doesn't work at all. And this is purely because of other characters who are important but definitely not protagonists of Xenoblade 1. You clearly can't call Melia one, as her character journey was so unfinished that the developers themselves were complaining about it, which led them to actually finish it in Future Connected a decade later, and she's in more of the story and does more prominent things than Fiora. Dunban is the protagonist of a story we never get to play, only seeing the battle in Sword Valley at the beginning of the game. And, I mean, he's there for a lot of it, but he's, again, more of a mentor role, taking the backseat. And you can't really call the mentor a protagonist unless the entire point of the story is about how that character goes around teaching others and the methods they go about that and the troubles they're in. We don't focus on Dunban that much for it to be the case, and even then he's present for a larger percentage of the story than Fiora is. Really, the thing is, while later on in the game they choose to show Shulk and Fiora as like these two sides of the thing, and they have a duality present in them, Fiora just isn't present for enough of the story to count as a second protagonist. The only character you could argue is focused on remotely nearly as much as Shulk is Melia, and even then, she clearly isn't a co-protagonist with him. And like, a major complaint people have with Xenoblade 1's story is that it is the Shulk show too often, so it would be weird to acknowledge that as a sticking point some people have and then just say there is another protagonist. Lastly, though, we arrive at the idea of Xenogears having a second protagonist, and here's where it becomes a bloodbath, because there are a few characters you could call secondary protagonists in terms of importance, but none of the ones who actually get enough importance to be remotely reaching that level are the one the game was trying to set up as the second protagonist. Very similar to what was done with Noah and Mio so many years later, Faye and Ellie are clearly supposed to be the two most important characters that everything and everyone else revolves around, but largely due to Disc 2 being the way it is, Ellie doesn't have that much screen time. We are primarily focusing on Faye's point of view throughout the entire game, and Ellie is not in the party for a significant chunk of Disc 1, then when she's there on a more permanent level for the majority of Disc 2, we're stuck in visual novel mode, simply narrating things. And while she does get some of the narration, and that clearly elevates her, she is not the only character to do so. Citan and Bart also get narration sections, as well as POV sections largely following them earlier on in Disc 1. Billy also gets a section where he leads the party, but he's significantly less prominent than the other two guys are throughout the rest of his appearances in the story, so you can't really count him there. Basically, a big complaint about Xenogears in its writing is, similar to Shulk and Xenoblade 1, the story of Xenogears focuses primarily on Faye, Ellie, Citan, and Bart, and unfortunately, Ellie really isn't in second place out of those four. I don't think Citan's role in the story could really be considered protagonist, because his entire deal is being mysterious and a mentor to Faye, and the struggles of mentorship aren't part of his character or his arc. He does have a character arc that gets completed, and is given plenty of time to do that, but I don't really think it's okay to consider the mysterious character we don't know a lot about for a very long time to be a protagonist unless there's literally no other choice, like with Elma in Xenoblade X. As for Bart, though, yeah, a huge amount of the story is Faye being a supporting character to him and doing things for him, furthering his goals and character arc. Even partially into Disc 2, Bart-related things are still happening and new developments are going on in that sense. So, he really is the closest to taking protagonist status, but it still feels wrong to consider him one because, well, he was not intended to be a co-protagonist by the writers when they were designing the background and initially writing what would eventually become Xenogears. It was very obviously Faye and Ellie, telegraphed in the exact same way as Noah and Mio are telegraphed in Xenoblade 3, they just ran out of time to finish the game and had to ship Disc 2 in the state it was. As such, many of Ellie's crowning character moments are just cutscenes, abridged or narrated over entirely without really directly getting to see, so not only are her coolest moments compromised, we don't really get to see a lot of her character development that leads to them because she was clearly supposed to be a permanent party member for the majority of Disc 2, and we just don't get to see most of that because Disc 2 happened. So, while out of all these characters, she would be the one least present in the story to be considered still a protagonist, besides maybe Mithrite, including base game Xenoblade 2 in the beginning of that, it's really hard to call her one purely because her most protagonist-y moments were compromised by Disc 2, so I think calling Faye the protagonist of Gears, but acknowledging that Ellie should be the second one if it was released in a more complete state, is where we end up here. And yeah, that's the entire video. Those are my thoughts and musings on who counts as a protagonist in Xeno games, and, well, we can revisit this idea when another one comes out. Granted, I think the next one is going to be a re-release of X or Saga, so not really much to say there. It's going to be the same characters from those to begin with, but you know what I mean. Until next time, which is probably going to be a Dawntrail discussion, rambly video, and then more Xeno stuff, this is Luxon, signing off.